Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to conduct a very interesting multi-level experiment. You're going to be aware of some of the experiment, and you're not going to be aware of the other elements of the experiment. This episode is going to be called That Day. That's all we're ever going to call it. I'm going to talk in a very metaphorical way about that day. It might take some of you just a few seconds to know what I'm talking about. Others will get it right away. There's a day in the history of anyone alive, I would say after cognitively, anyone born, say 1990 or before, this day has changed your life consciously. You were conscious on the day that it occurred. On the day happened. For some of you, you were born either after 1990, before this day, and you could barely remember it, or you're born after the day, and you know no other world before this day. This day is very, very important because it is a multi-layered day. It is the peak of what can happen when a people fall asleep for decades, when they're willing to accept a marginalized existence in this world, meaning their sovereign rights, they're not so conscious of them, and therefore they get taken away. And let me give you a silly analogy that you can tell other people. Imagine you had a pretty dense house. Lots of little things. Maybe you're a collector. You've got crystals or pottery or dolls or Star Wars figures or whatever. But you have all kinds of collections in the same house. So you have just thousands of knickknacks. And you have this sort of coming and going of perhaps neighbors and friends or whatever. Help. Assistance, and they all gradually remove items from your house that are not in plain sight. They remove an item that's deep inside of a shelf, that's sort of in the shadows. They find a box and they open it up and they just simply take something out of it. You still see the box. You don't see into the shadows. But before you know it, couple of years goes by, or maybe even a decade, and it comes time for you to move to a better location, or maybe you just want to rearrange your home. You built a new extension onto your house, and you're thinking, man, I want to get all these things that I can't see. Everything that's in the boxes, everything stuck in the shadows, and I want to get them over to this other room so I can see them. And all of a sudden you realize they're gone because you weren't paying attention. And then part of you says, well, I don't want to have to pay attention that much. My God, I mean, I shouldn't have to inventory my entire house just to make sure I still possess what I possess. Those of you who live in homes like me, you probably have a garage, a couple boxes in there of old things. I don't go through my old boxes. And that's the way our Constitution is handled. That's the way our rights are handled. In 2018, amazing things are already happening, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg. But a lot of what allowed this day to occur continued long after this day and even grew more complex and more acidic to freedom. But for the very first time in probably 60-some years, a change is occurring in the United States of America. It is a beautiful change, and it is something that is spreading across the world. As long as it is unimpeded, you're going to see things this year that you couldn't possibly imagine if you're an average citizen. And for those of you who are fully awake, it's the year you've been waiting for. So that day, I get questions from time to time to comment about that day that occurred in the past. Let's review what that day contained. And this is going to be metaphorical, because apparently the social media corporations that allow this information to be posted on their websites have decided to join the opposing force of freedom. They have decided to aid and abet those individuals that don't want you to have your freedom. They are part of the problem. And in a way, their employees, as well as their heads of state, should all be charged with the violation of this country's First Amendment. I'll give you a quick example. When you rent property or you apply for a job, there are laws that guarantee, regardless of your race or sex, at least those two, they cannot deny you the job. Of course, if there's a job for a male model, you probably couldn't get it if you were a female, and vice versa. But outside those very exceptional, probably fairly balanced hiring regimens, no one can stop you legally. When you open up a corporation inside the boundaries of the United States of America, you must abide by the Constitution. And no policies that you can develop otherwise can be implied and overridden onto that Constitution. Meaning you can't forbid freedom of speech, technically speaking, within a freedom of speech Constitution country. Some of you will remember about half a decade ago a couple that was gay went in to get a wedding cake made by a person who was religious in a Christian way. And that person decided, I am not making you this cake because I do not sanction what you are trying to do, which is to get married. And the ACLU came in, and that couple sued the bakery. A judge swung a gavel and said, you have to go against your religion and make this cake for these people. That, I believe, is unconstitutional in itself. Forcing someone to do something they don't want to do should always be unconstitutional in a free market. But you can see how in one standard they enforce it to the nines. Another standard, we all look away. But the year we have always been waiting for is upon us. The year that we take over and bring back balanced freedom. The year that we educate our kids about having lost that freedom and what we have to do to make sure that it sticks out worse than any atrocity ever glorified in history. But we're just at the tip of the iceberg. A lot can happen. Our current leaders who are trying to effect this change may be compromised physically, and we will have to pick up the baton and continue running. They take down one of us, we need two of us to stand up and own it. If they take down those two, then four of us have to get up. We need to absolutely crush their bones when it comes to trying to hold us down with money and shills and people who will sell out. People who are supposedly so mentally fragile they consider themselves the disenfranchised, the snowflakes. That day, the world changed, the whole world. And ridiculous policies still exist as a result of that day. Ridiculous laws exist. Ridiculous executive orders exist in the United States of America. That day changed the way that we are allowed to communicate between each other in this world. Our privacy is gone. Me traveling to you and you traveling to me is impeded. We must grovel and pay money to get back some of the freedoms that we used to have. On that day, 3 structures in New York City were obliterated. 1 structure outside of Washington, D.C. was damaged. And 4 aircraft disappeared. We are told that nearly 3,000 people disappeared or were at least removed from this world. Prior to that day, there was no imminent threat communicated to the public of any kind. Even though the gentleman who was accused of orchestrating the event had been mentioned in government travels, there was no outward mass media notification that this person might be just about to do something. Of course, all that narrative is actually untrue to begin with, which might be why the MSM didn't want to touch it. But there was a gentleman by the name of Bill Cooper who broke the story. You see, this person who was accused of orchestrating the event was supposedly hunted by our top individuals in our government that are supposed to be able to find people and incarcerate them, capture them, eliminate them. Now, this individual was an asset of our country. He had been an asset of our country since he helped fight the Afghan war, holding back the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. There's plenty of videos of him holding a walkie-talkie, a satellite walkie-talkie, orchestrating attacks. In the end, the person who does this is trying to effect change within the paradigm of what they believe to be right. He was a rich kid, a very, very rich kid who wanted to do something, wanted to have some fun. And so when someone offered him the job of being the point of contact between our country and Afghanistan, which wasn't his native world, he leaped at the opportunity to be important. So in the 70s, he became a hired asset of the United States of America, the division of which I will let you look up. But before that day, Bill Cooper was one of the only people in the world to put together the fact that our military and all of our intelligence were unable to find this person. But then a news network, which is probably most likened to that of a fraudulent news network, was able to gain access to him fairly effortlessly and interview him. And this is where they began to prime the pump of predictive programming for this day, putting him sort of in the lexicon, waking up the consciousness of this country and perhaps the world to say, remember this guy? He's a little radical. We're telling you that he's radical. His answers to the questions weren't exactly that radical. But the precursor to the interview, the breaks between the interview, and the exit summary of the interview branded him a chaotic person who would do just about anything for his cause. And this is when Bill Cooper stepped in and said in one of his nightly podcasts, he said, they are preparing something. They will be only acronymed as DS, I should say abbreviated. Prior to the event, they killed Bill Cooper. If you don't know who that is, he's an individual that said that he was on a naval ship, I believe in the 60s. I think it was 67-ish. And he said that he was standing on the deck of the ship performing his guard duty. This will make you roll your eyes a little bit depending on where you come from. But there's sort of an interesting summary to the end of this story as well, other than his assassination, to cover up events that were going to precede this day. But Bill Cooper said that he saw the ocean open up in the black of night, and I want you to think about an ocean lit only by moonlight, and dimly so, A gentleman standing on the deck of a ship and looking out and seeing an orifice about the proportion of an eyeball opening up. It's deep. The water is now going down into this slit. And he said vehicles left the ocean and flew into the sky with no noise whatsoever. And there were multiple of them, 2 or 3. He is utterly in shock and he is stunned. Before he could call out back to the command central, as I remember the story, it happened again, except they're coming out of the sky. It would appear that different ones were going back in. Just swallowed up into the ocean, no splash, no nothing, silent. He calls into the central command inside the ship and says, guys, I just saw something really strange. The ship is like, well, we just tracked something strange. And within a few hours, the ship was visited by a helicopter, dropping off individuals in black suits that said, you're not to tell anyone any of this. And they swore everyone who was involved to a gag order. But eventually Bill was pulled into this program that monitors such events. And he spent probably the better part of 3 decades inside this program, researching things, reading things, being told things. And after he popped out in about 1995, he said, I may have been duped the entire time, save the initial event that I saw. What I saw could have been our stuff, could have been out of this world, but that first part definitely happened because everything after that was simply told to me or I was shown photographs. So he's an eccentric individual. And for whatever reason, seeing that as a young man, as a soldier, opened his mind. He was no longer looking at things as they were being dictated to him. He was inaugurated into an organization that said the world isn't what you think it is. And once you open up that critical thinking, you can never close it unless someone hits you on the head or gives you shock treatment and a bunch of chemicals to burn out your brain. You will always be lucid once you become lucid. Less toxicity and age rob you of that. The day before that day, a very interesting thing happened because Donald Rumsfeld came out and announced to the public that the Pentagon had lost $2.2 trillion. The initial number was $4.4 trillion. And to put that in perspective, I think the whole military operation since 2003 has cost Americans about, $2 to $3 trillion. So this was a big amount of money. And on that day, that investigation was completely erased because one of the structures that was struck had all the investigation papers put on that side of the structure intentionally such that when it was struck and it burned, all the investigation paperwork was lost. And the law firm that was actually investigating, in air quotes, was in a building in New York that also met an early demise. A building that suffered no direct impact that caused the other 2 much larger buildings to have a problem. Our leader was visiting a group of school kids. He was out of the pocket. When the event kicked off, an aircraft supposedly impacted a structure in New York City. Supposedly filmed by a film crew covering some incidental work by, I believe, a fire department. The public recalls it incorrectly in terms of seeing the footage of this film crew. The public thinks that we had that footage right away, especially now since it's been many years since this day. The truth of the matter is that we didn't get that footage for a couple days because I remember waiting for it, waiting for something. Approximately an hour later, allegedly another aircraft drops out of the sky and hits the second structure. It is dramatic. It is a shock and awe moment if there ever was one. But interestingly enough, out of all the individuals I've ever met that said they were there and that they saw these events occur, especially the second event, when I truly pinned them down to say, did you actually see it with your own eyes? They said, well, yeah, I was downstairs watching it on a television. I was in my house watching it on a television. I am personally yet to meet a person who witnessed this vehicle in the sky impact the structure. They all think they did because they want to be a part of the heroic archetype of this story in one way. And I don't mean to criticize. It's not a criticism at all. It is simply, if you endured the horror of that day and you survived, you've got to give yourself some merit, some credit. The closer you are to an event like this, the more shocking it is to your system. And if you can survive with a steady mind, then you have succeeded in one way or another. So hats off to you. Once each structure had suffered the initial strike, things started to happen. Sounds started to come out of the basement of these structures. Sounds that are very indicative of explosives. Booms and roars. Big plumes of clouds coming out of the bottom of these structures, out of every single opening and orifice, just pouring out smoke here and there. People unseen attempted to report this information. Some of the recordings of their eyewitness testimony have survived the huge sweep of organizations that went in and said, if you film this, we demand your footage. We demand your camera. We demand your hard drives, your memory cards, whatever you used. We demand it, and we will censor it and give it back to you. And that's how a lot of things were erased. Further south, in the Washington, D.C. area, a similar situation occurred, at least as in the official story. A vehicle supposedly struck a structure. Same type of vehicle. It supposedly hit two other structures, north. In a fourth situation, we have a vehicle that landed in Cleveland, Ohio, was taxied to a specific hangar, not owned by the airport in which it was a part of. Individuals were taken off the plane, and the plane then left. And then it was reported that this plane never landed, and that this heroic situation occurred where the occupants of the plane decided to fight back. And when they did, the individual who had taken over and commandeered the plane flew it erratically. One report said upside down, and it was said to have crashed into a tiny sliver in the soil, of which has been later confirmed as already existing 2 years earlier by the farmer that dug it. No wreckage, nothing indicative of what we have seen in recent events in 2018 with a plane that was knocked out of the sky to eliminate one informant. We have seen aircraft that have crashed into mountains. We've seen it. There are tail sections and engines. There's always engines. Big, giant, 28,000-pound titanium engines. You can't get rid of that. You could let it drop straight out of the sky. You could put a rocket on its back and push it into a wall, and there's still going to be recognizable debris. In one case in New York, they said they found such an engine, but when examined, it wasn't nearly the size it needed to be, and wasn't made by the manufacturer that made the engines in the other vehicles. The initial impact to the building in Washington, D.C. left a very round hole in the side of the building and penetrated two interior rings, the external ring and then two others, very similar to an event that we had seen in the 90s when one Slobodan Milosevic had his house hit by other weapons that drop out of the bottom of planes, that are launched from submarines, that are launched from destroyers. The first eyewitness in Washington, D.C. said he saw a missile with wings. He was very adamant about that. and that he was outside the building when the event occurred. When he was interviewed 4 hours later, he said he was inside the building, changing his location, and that it was most definitely a certain brand of airline that he absolutely did not mistaken at supposedly 450 miles an hour what the side of this thing said. I challenge you to stand on the ground and have 10 of these vehicles fly by with different paint jobs on the fuselage, and you're literally at ground level and you're seeing these things fly 8 feet over the ground, or 1 foot over the ground, at 450 miles an hour. I'll put you in a little safe bunker, but you need to read which one went by in each one of the instances, and I'm willing to bet you can't do it. Now, we don't need to recall every single event of the particular day because we know how it went, don't we? The second structure impacted fell first. The first structure impact fell second. And the third structure in New York that was never hit by anything fell into its own footprint through most likely a very orchestrated process. All three of the structures were able to fall into their footprint as if they had no structure underneath them, holding them up. The structure in DC, well, it had some additional help because prior to the actual event that is officially recorded in history, they had an event that occurred 5 minutes before, which compromised the structure's integrity, set fires to the building, and was most likely responsible for a few fatalities internally. And they were responding to this other event in that building 5 minutes before the official story event that happened to it. Now, the bummer of this day, and there are several bummers of this day, is that science will tell us that that day could not have occurred the way that we witnessed it to have occurred as related to the official story. We witnessed what occurred. Nothing can take that away. We did not witness the structure in D.C. And all of the eyewitnesses, save those who were really paying attention on that particular day, none of which I've ever met, we all saw it through the eyes of a television feed, which means that what we saw was manipulated and changed before we saw it. The individuals that orchestrated this were exceptionally brilliant people. Most likely sociopathic people who are willing to trade their own valor, their own demented demonic valor among each other for the ultimate drop of dopamine and adrenaline that any human being has ever experienced in their life. For if someone can be happy to see such a thing occur, we can scientifically say they are without conscience. They are without any belief in a God. Either they can't conceive of what's after this life, or they simply have dabbled in it a little bit and decided there's nothing after this. Or they believe in a completely different story, that undoing life, undoing freedom, is going to be rewarded in that afterlife by entities that typically we do not endorse. The question of who exactly did it would probably fit in a dossier. It would fit in a large document. If you knew all of the truth of who was involved in this event of that day, it would implicate a lot of people who never get in front of a microphone, who are never interviewed by anyone, and who are extremely loyal to the byproduct of that day. And therefore, keeping it a secret is not a problem. Their entire life is a secret. Their entire existence is that devotion. And it always has been. They don't have to learn how to keep a secret. They are a secret. For most of us honest people, which is 99.999% of the world, we live in truth every day because we don't like cancer. We don't like that feeling of angst and holding in a lie. But that remaining percentage, that fraction of a percent of individuals that are raised in these certain families, they don't have to keep a secret because they never talk to anyone about it who doesn't already know about their secret. It's only a secret to us because we don't know what they do. But we have endorsed and glamorized organizations that keep themselves hidden, don't we? Haven't we? Up until probably the last 15 years, as the awakening has started to accelerate. We now know them to be more diabolical and more evil than we ever thought they were. And now we know that they actually have posed a threat to us ever since they conceived of themselves, ever since they chartered their life to oppose ours. There's a great movie by Pixar called Bug's Life, and I used to talk about this a lot in Season 1, and it's a good time to remember this movie. And for those of you who missed it, this won't spoil anything for you. You're not probably likely to go back and watch an old 3D cartoon. But Pixar snuck out a great story, and it's been told several times, but I actually think that for my money, Bug's Life, pound for pound, tells the story more accurately than any sort of on-point movie I've ever seen, which is that there are millions and millions and millions of ants, all living their little lives, living good lives, being honest to each other in this particular story, and that a few grasshoppers, which are bigger and definitely capable of conquering an ant one-on-one, come in and start killing and pillaging and wreaking havoc on this ant community, and then the ants cower down to the grasshoppers. The grasshoppers actually aren't that smart. They're smart enough to impose their muscle. They're smart enough to take advantage of the good nature of these ants to convince them to surrender all their sovereignty and all their rights. But eventually, by the end of the film, obviously, the main character realizes that there are a lot more ants than there are grasshoppers. A lot more. And they fight back and they win. You've seen this in Three Amigos. You've seen this in all kinds of films. Tron Uprising was another example which was canceled because it was bringing this archetype to everyone's knowledge that the few can, the many can defeat the few. The blue can defeat the red. After this day, there were a couple other events that were synthesized into existence that continued to erode our ability to travel freely. You now have to get undressed partially to get onto an aircraft. All because of fake events that never occurred. An individual that supposedly fiddled with his shoes and did a piss poor job of pulling off the event. But that one person changed the entire planet. How many billions of times have human beings been asked to take off their shoes as a result of that fake event? The event that occurred, which was never supposed to succeed, but was supposed to inject into our world the necessity to take our shoes off. Another fake event. 27 men were accused in London, England, of bringing on liquids onto a plane that could have destroyed the plane. I was up the night that the story broke. The 27 was then reduced to 7. The 7 were detained, and the 7 were released because it never happened. But it happened in a foreign country. If you're an American, it didn't happen in our country. Who paid the price? Well, around the world, you can no longer take a certain amount of liquid onto a plane. They don't care about what they're trying to proverbially protect you from. They only care about conditioning us into giving up our rights in the name of some liberty, giving up freedom, which is the same thing as the freedom that is taken away. Now, I had it explained to me by an individual. He said, "You know the difference between freedom and liberty?" And I said, "It's the same thing." And he goes, "No." He goes, "Liberty is freedom from your government, and freedom is just freedom." As a result of this day, if you really think about it, millions of people in this world no longer exist. A couple at least. They are gone. They are dead as a result of this day. But there are tens of millions of people who are suffering grave consequences as a result of this day. And I'm not talking about people who have to take off their shoes all of a sudden. I'm talking about people who've had their countries destroyed, their schools, their hospitals, their roads, their bridges destroyed, accused of being involved with this day when they had nothing to do with this day, and their leadership had nothing to do with this day. Regardless if their leadership would have thought the day was good or bad, they had no direct involvement. Unfortunately, a bunch of good souls have been convinced that the souls that aren't involved should be punished and should be killed and should be destroyed as a result of that day. Sold a bill of goods that if you don't understand a particular human in this world, then they are part of the group that made this day happen. And it's better that you eliminate them out of complete confusion instead of taking the risk that that language that you can't understand might be trading information that'll make that day happen again. Now, when you first start waking up to that day, most of you have probably completed a decade at least of full consciousness of that day being fraudulent. And we mention it all the time on the show. But this particular video, we're going to leave out its name. You get swept away by all the factual anomalies, meaning things that you were told that happened on that day that later you find out scientifically are probably impossible. All kinds of countries were involved in that day outside of our country. One of the narratives that's going on is that the individuals that were said to have participated as the drivers, I should say, of the vehicles, all had their identification mapped back to a particular country, which is well known for oil exports. When investigated, we found out that at least 51% of these individuals were alive and well, as identified by the official narrative. And so the government simply said, well, their identification was confiscated and used by other individuals. So right away, 51 to 60% of these individuals are completely mysterious to us because the faces and names that were offered to us as the individuals who participated are not those individuals because they're alive and well. No one seems to care. For anyone that was really involved, you can probably guarantee yourself they have been eliminated from this planet as a matter of a contingency to make sure that they never show up anywhere else being filmed by someone, and to make sure they don't run their mouth about what they know, to help us piece together the puzzle pieces to see what actually did occur. In the end, it's a situation like this. There are so many smoking guns that prove that the official story of that day did not actually occur, that all you need as an individual is one that convinces you that what you were told didn't occur, and then you can move on with life. As of this year, 2018, we have finally had the individuals and the groups largely revealed. We've had the governments and the institutions within those governments who are extremely corrupt identified. And now it's the slow process of building the case against them such that when they are tried, they are not tried in a normal courtroom with a jury that can be coerced and programmed to give a testimony of favorable results to those criminals, but that we pull them into what's called a military tribunal, a military trial where there is no jury, where the facts must just be analyzed, the verdict's handed down, and the incarceration or capital punishment is served. For those of you wondering why the criminals that we know exist in this country that I'm in right now have not been charged, that's what's going on. The case is being built to make sure there's no jury. These individuals have committed such egregious crimes of treason. There's an old tactic that's been used for millennia, and that is if you're going to build a criminal organization, one of the things you have to make sure is that anyone who's in on the team is compromised. That you have some dirt on them, such that if they want to run their mouth, you release that information on them and discredit them. But you don't really want to get to that point, so you let them know that you've got that dirt on them, and they tend to behave absolute. We can assume that once these individuals are involved, they're compromised, right? But we tend to think of it as a single individual, a person who's compromised. But this type of event is such a big event and requires a level of suspension of disbelief that is so intense if you have just the smallest level of intelligence, whether it be physics or engineering or both, metallurgy, aeronautics, explosives. When you have knowledge in those areas, just a basic amount, you have a big giant thread coming out of a big sweater, and it's big enough to put two hands on it and yank. It's big enough to tie it to the hitch of your truck and drive off and unravel that sweater. And that's what's occurred. It's not just an individual who knew what happened that day, it's other countries that with armada of scientists that could pick it apart. And how do you get them to be quiet? You involve them. You work out a deal. You say if you're willing to keep your mouth shut, you can be involved in this and you can benefit from this economically and socially. The economic benefits are pretty straightforward. Whatever resources we can gain as a result of this day, which is usually the energy that we use, the substance we use to create energy in this world and make a lot of money, you're going to get it at a discount, you know. But more popular to these organizations and these countries, or at least the corrupt factions within these countries, they get control. And how do they get control? Because that day gave the impression that we aren't safe and we are allowing liberty to go away, which is the freedom from your government. We're allowing the governments to swoop in and take control, giving up, in the end, the pure commodity that is freedom. Now, all of us have our different stories about that day. I will share two personal experiences that I have had that provided a magnifying glass on two of the smoking guns that many of you already know about. But it's better than someone telling you that they saw a YouTube video or they saw some article and then regurgitating it back to you, right? So these are two events that occurred to me, that I want to share. I've had a very close friend who was very close to the architect that designed the structures, the two tallest structures that were involved in this. Those structures were so tall that one of the chief questions asked by all of those that had to approve the structures was, what happens if a vehicle that flies impacts the structure? How do you guarantee that this won't have a horrible, catastrophic, cascading effect on the structure, thus bringing it down? And the architect said, we designed this structure with that in mind. The designer designed this structure to survive 5 direct impacts from the largest vehicle that flies in the air at that time, fully loaded and with both fuel and passengers, which is only 75 pounds less than the actual impacts that occurred. Let's rewind that so you can understand. A single point of contact, not multiple points of contact, but the same exact spot, was actually designed to survive 5 vehicles back to back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now think about that. That took me a while to say, didn't it? They're never going to come in that quick. But it could survive 5 direct impacts into the same location. Yet one, not fully loaded aircraft, supposedly flew at speeds that are not possible at sea level, hit the structures, and they fell, free fall. The architect proceeded to continue with his answer, elaborating, these structures are so absolutely strong that you could pick it up if you were a giant and shake it and put it back down, and it would be 99.9% exactly as strong as it was, provided you could reattach it to the ground properly as it was before you shook it. That's how absolutely strong those structures were built. That's a first-degree witness asking the architect the question, elaborating on it for 15 to 30 minutes, and concluding the conversation. And I know the individual, first degree, who had the conversation. Second event that occurred to me. I was at a television set as a guest of the host who hosted the show. On this show, they were building aircraft. 3 of them. Because anything that flies, anything that leaves the ground and under its own propulsion is a flying vehicle. The FAA has to certify that vehicle before any attempt to fly occurs to ensure that the occupant / pilot of the vehicle is going to be safe to a certain minimum degree. I was eating lunch with 2 of these individuals from the FAA. We had a little tiny table at this set. We're outside. It's a beautiful summer day. It's nice and warm. I'm the 5th wheel because on the other side of the table are 2 of the world's most celebrated stunt pilots who have done everything. Crazy stunt flying of prop planes, the guys that get out on the wings and stand there and crawl around, guys who switch planes in mid-flight. I mean, these guys know everything about planes. They started having a conversation with each other about that day. They said, what do you think about that day? And they all kind of looked around and they looked at each other, and things got a little somber, a little strange, and those eyeballs that went back and forth between essentially top guns, individuals that know more about aviation than most people in the world. And it was strange to me because I was completely asleep. The official story was all I knew about that day. And it wasn't until about a year later that I had any level of awakening, and I had completely forgotten this conversation until much later. But they looked at each other, and it was that look of like, are you asking me this question because you don't believe what happened that day, or you asking me that question because you know something? They were guarded. Grown men. I think they were probably in their late 40s, early 50s. And there was this weird stare at each other. It was interesting. I'm being very quiet. I don't say a word because I don't know anything other than what I was told on television. And one of the stunt pilots said, well, you know, the week after that day, I went and rented time in a simulator, a flight simulator. And I dialed up the vehicle that was supposed to have accomplished the second impact on the structure. And I attempted 11 times to pull that off. And not only was it, he basically just said he was not capable of pulling off the maneuver. And he's one of the best pilots in the world. And he has got commercial flight time as well, just so you know. That's his main job, as I understand it. And he was very quiet, very muted when he said all this. He wasn't excited. He wasn't a guy that tells the 8-foot fish story, right? And the FAA guy that started the conversation paused and he said, "Yeah, me too." He quoted how many times he tried. It was over half a dozen times. It was nearly 11 times. He says, "I couldn't do it either." And that's pretty much where the conversation ended. It was a way of four guys talking to each other and saying, something smells bad. Now, more recently, in the last 5 years, probably the last 2 years to be honest, journalists, individuals that want to investigate the true facts of a story, have made phone calls, sort of a double-blinded conversation with pilots, and said, how fast can you go with sea level in this particular type of plane? Not referring to that day whatsoever. Acting like a student of the art of aviation. And then they called several individuals and recorded the conversation, which was then turned into a video that was posted online. Every answer was that you can't do it. You can't get over, I think the amount that was the maximum speed, I believe, was quoted at somewhere between 250 to 275 aeronautical miles per hour, because the air is too thick. And so the student / journalist said, well, what if you wanted to? What if you just threw down the throttles and you said, go, go, go? Especially, what if you use the momentum of falling from a higher altitude down to the lower altitude? Could you pull it off then? And the answer came back unanimously, you'd rip the wings off. You'd rip the wings off, the plane would disintegrate, and there's no way that this could have occurred. This could occur, I should say, which to us means it couldn't have occurred. Now, for those of you who are very familiar with that day, you're going to have a little angst in your body right now, if not a tremendous amount of angst in your body, and it's going to be driven by one thing, which is, come on, dude, talk about all of it. Talk about my favorite smoking gun that day. I have to apologize. My neighbor is working on something on his house, and so he's using a grinder in his backyard. I'm going to mention two more things, for sure. I might mention more. But one can sit and contest science, right? Because what has science turned into in this world? Science has turned into theoretical science in most cases. It's the most glamorous because, like I've said in many of my other science-based episodes, you can tell yourself anything on a piece of paper. You can invent complete different paradigms of existence on a piece of paper. You don't have to prove anything. No one's allowed to touch you. Oh, they can criticize you and peer review your paper and what have you, but you don't have to prove anything. So someone could come in and come up with another theory on paper as to why all the things that we know, the architects and engineers with PhDs in all relative technologies have said is impossible that day. You can contest it, can't you? The answer is yes. You could contest it. You can contest that 2 + 2 = 4. How many lights do you see? They asked Picard. Taken from 1984. There were 3 individuals who witnessed the event, who filmed the event over a body of water from a very safe distance. And as these events unfolded in New York City, they celebrated. They jumped up and down on top of their vehicle, a van, and they celebrated each time an impact occurred. But they extra celebrated each time that the structures fell. They were reported to the authorities, they were detained, and then they were released. At that point, it was just a suspicious group of kids, all in their 20s, filming this with video cameras, celebrating each event. And you could say to yourself, well, they're just deranged children who celebrate in the loss of others, and those kids are out there. But then those kids went home to their home country, which is not the United States of America. They were interviewed on a television show that's very similar to something you might see on MTV, and they were questioned about why they were celebrating this event and why they got arrested in the first place. And one of them said on national television, aired across the world and recorded on many DVRs and republished on YouTube, that they were there merely to document the day, to document the event. That is a smoking gun of admission, not a smoking gun of science. It shows that they had foreknowledge of the event. Their employment was linked back to a very similar type of corrupt organization in their country that we believe was involved on our side of the fence. It's a smoking gun that doesn't require any scientific method to contradict. The interesting thing is that our fraudulent news organizations did not cover it in any detail. It never became a front page story. Never became the grounds for a gigantic investigation. They were allowed to return to normal life, being sort of participants in one way or another. I don't believe personally that they actually participated in the mechanics that made the day occur necessarily. Perhaps they were, but they wouldn't have to have been to be completely guilty of the day's events. Later, the vehicle was commandeered, obviously as part of the apprehension of these individuals, and it was tested. And the forensics evidence came back glaring. The vehicle that they were standing on top of was definitely a part of the day, for the substances they found in the back of this vehicle tested positive for what might be the chemical structures that participated in the ultimate demise of these structures. It was linked back to some company that had also had its CEO flee the country before that day, or soon after. But there's a fourth one that's always stuck in my head, and it was reported in a film that was very, very popular, that its name has the implication of available coinage. Let's just put it that way. Ancillary coinage. And they reported that a silo was demolished within a comfortable amount of time prior to this day. And I think it was just loosely insinuated that perhaps that was a test. And I don't believe that at all. Having come from the Midwest and entered silos for granaries and a bunch of other uses, facilities, they're empty. They're big, giant, empty buildings. If you needed a place to stage this operation, if you needed a place to put together the actual substances that were used for this particular day, that would have been a beautiful staging area. When it's over, you simply demolish it and you erase the staging area. If you demolish it, then the chemicals that would be traced back to this particular day would be all over the place in an explained way, because the structure was actually brought down by those chemicals. Technically, probably not the case, but it would be enough that someone could insinuate, hey, you found these chemicals. That's what we used in part, in theory, on the periodic table of chemicals can do this kind of thing, and so you shouldn't worry about it. So then the whole thing splits in half. For those of you who are angered about that day, eats a little, hole in your heart, I would beg you to let that go. Don't let their event do any more harm to you genetically and mentally than it already has. Be free of it. Let it go. What time really exists? The now. That's the only time that really exists. Oh, you can theorize about events that you've had in your past because you have this database in the universe that you can access that lets you remember your past. But you got to move on. You got to live in the now. Here are the facts, most likely, about this particular day. This is the split in two situation. The first thing you need to come to grips with, and you should be able to sleep at night. The individuals that participated in this particular day will most likely all get away scot-free from us. They will exit this world without any penalization of their existence. As you know, I've theorized several times about what happens after this life. None of us officially know. There are some pretty strong indicators that there is a phase after this life, and there's probably a phase before this life, and it's probably been a phase that's been going in a loop ever since we conceived of this particular existence. Whether or not there are penalties on the other side of this phase, we don't know. Maybe it's a game. Maybe it doesn't matter what we do because it just goes in a big loop. You get taken out one way one time, and you get taken out another way another time. Maybe you're killed by a criminal. Maybe you just pass away out of old age. We've said in several episodes on this show that you have to have evil to know good. Well, if there's any accolade to these people whatsoever, it is that they have done a beautiful job heightening our awareness of good, for they have forged their souls out of pure, concentrated evil. If they are to pray for anything after this life, it is that God does not exist, that there is no real measure of a soul, that you can merely do whatever you want to do in this world and die and be forgiven and come back, and you can be just as much of a bastard in your next life as you were in the previous one. I think most of us would like to believe that there is something very strong and very definitive about behaving like that as soon as one passes, and that there's somehow some justice on the other side. There are various religions that believe if you commit such crimes on society, that you are damned for several iterations back to this world. Who knows? But they are going to get away scot-free. They will. If nothing else, the individuals who participated in this, that are commonly named as participants in this, they were old when this whole thing occurred, and it's been several years since this occurred, right? Over a decade. In a few years, it'll be 2 decades. And they'll be dead. They'll be dead through natural causes. But even if you drug them into some penitentiary, some sort of incarceration, perhaps even hung them at the end of a gallows, they lived most of their life the way they wanted to live it. They've had all the spoils of deceit and ill-gotten gains that you could possibly gain out of this world. If Christianity has any bearing on what happens after this world, then the next phase of their life is going to be one of unimaginable torment. Maybe that's right. I don't know. But the other half of this day is to itemize what has happened since this day that needs to be reversed. The lunacy, the craziness, the war and the death, the rationale to hurt another human being. I should say rationales. We have to do what we can to undo the infectious ideas that came out of that day. I was completely and utterly swept away by the next 12 months after that day of wanting to retaliate on who they told me was responsible for that day. There was an individual I mentioned in a previous episode who lived in the neighborhood I lived in. He had a big truck, big old American truck. And he put 2 gigantic American flags just behind the cab, preceding the back bucket area of the truck. But he also put 2 signs on his car. One in front of the radiator and one behind the glass of his cab. How he backed up, I'll never know. And the signs read 2 words: Nuke 'em. And he drove around and people honked and screamed and yelled. We're all very happy to see that truck. And I was so swept away with the propaganda of that particular day that I completely, at the time, was 100% behind the guy. 100%. I had several employees on that day. Several. And I would say I had a day of poor judgment now that I look back. And in a very small circle of my employees, probably about 4 of them, I voiced such an opinion of what to do with these people. And one of my employees contradicted me and challenged me and said, I don't think you know what you're talking about. And it wasn't that he was aware of the day's events by any means. He just simply saw through the barbaric transformation of American consciousness to retaliate almost nonsensically. And he said, you don't know who did this. And you shouldn't run off to hurt other people until you do know who did this. And I didn't call him a bad word or anything, but I likened him to people that have been traitors to our country. And some years later, I don't know how many years later, I would say probably about 10 years later, I had the fortunate opportunity to reconnect with him through some online thing, and I apologized to him. And it wasn't that he had come around to the true events of that particular day, but I said, you were right, and I was wrong. I leaped at a kind of cheap solution, and you kept your mind in check. So I complimented him on that, and so I feel much better about that particular day for me. The other day that happened. It is safe to say that that day contained a tremendous amount of mistakes, impossibilities that were caught on national television, mistakes that were actually brought up by anchors who were covering that day 24/7, videos that were presented to the world that were the gigantic glaring effect problems that they had created that day. And we moved on because no one wants to have those thoughts on our mind, right? Most of us are sick and tired of seeing that day recalled on videos. We don't want to see the pictures of it anymore. We're tired of it. A lot of you have given up looking at it because, hey, you do know what happened that day and you have decided to move on, and that's probably the best thing to do. But it would seem that the individuals who are at a high level of authority that were not a part of this day are having their day today. And they're having their day every single day this year, and a lot last year. And they're preparing. But let's recall a similar archetype, because it's something that I think that we have to emulate. How many times have you seen the victim of a crime forgive someone who has taken someone from them? Someone who has removed a family member, perhaps greatly harmed them before they took them out of this world. Heinous things, unforgivable things. And yet the family members who lost that person, who have to remember that day every day that they wake up into a nightmare of sorts. They've had their children removed, their spouses, their fathers and their mothers. They find somehow the way to go into the room with that individual, have a discussion, and forgive them. We don't necessarily have to forgive, but what these individuals always say, usually, is that nothing I can do to the other person who did this to me, did this to my family member or friend, will ever bring back my family member or my friend. And they know that waking up in a state of hatred is going to ruin whatever days they have left in this world. The only thing they can do is continue living. If there is an afterlife, then these individuals will see that loved one again in some form or fashion, right? All that was undone on that day will never come back into existence the way it was. Even if we built the structures exactly the way they were when they existed prior to that day, it'll never bring back the human souls, put them back in their bodies. We can only hope that a lot of the, I'd say, recent events of the last decade where they forge these events and say that people were removed from this world that weren't. We know that people were removed from this world on that day. We know for a fact. But let's just hope that a good portion of those reported to have gone were simply fabricated into existence in the first place. Let's hope. Regardless, the day happened. Hundreds of people are no longer here. So what can we do about it? We can bring back critical thinking. We can bring back critical thinking as a result of that day and use that acidic moment in time to increase our critical thinking, or we can use fun things to bring back critical thinking. A large portion of this show's intent is to do just that. To use positive things to bring back critical thinking, to increase the lucidity if these days ever occur again. And they do occur again, don't they? In small little events. We find that actors pretend to be witnesses, pretend to be victims. We find rosters of people that are supposedly removed from this planet, later appearing at other events right in plain sight. The tip of the iceberg has been exposed as of February 2018. The corruption, the power of the few, the grasshoppers. We need to realize that we're the ants and that we just need to rise up. Fight back. In a lot of cases, there are alternatives to the tyranny that is being imposed on us. You don't have to engage in certain levels of physical inspection if you don't want to. If you feel so inclined, I would suggest that you take every alternative you possibly can to avoid that conditioning for your mind and to pass it on to your fellow citizens. In some cases, it might be fairly disruptive. In other cases, it'll just pull you out of the mix. And you can go on with your life a little bit more free as you might have been before that day occurred, right? There are events in history that are taught to our children, whether they be accurate or false, in which we say this thing happened and we have to make sure it never happens again. There are dozens and dozens of those things alive and well today that are still occurring. And we need to do what we can, in my opinion, to undo those things so that they stop occurring and that the acceptance of them being perpetrated on man are undone. Our forefathers did a pretty good job in America of figuring out some very generic ways of saying these are the rules by which we should live by, derived from, again, documents out of Europe. We have to preserve those ideas. We have to preserve those ideas as they are enacted on us in our society, bar none, because they were developed over thousands of years of suffering. Magna Carta did not come out of thin air. It was at great risk to those who drafted it in the first place. I'm sure people died trying to get it enacted. And I know that millions of people have died protecting it. Forget all of the wars that shouldn't have been fought, the wars that have been fought to preserve it and protect it and to duplicate it like software over here in the United States. We fought a very long war in this country, protecting it. Today, a war isn't all fought with guns. Today, a war is fought with the mind. You know this. I have an episode that is about life before this day. Go look it up. Life was good before this day, the one we're talking about. It is possible to reset the world back to the way it was prior to that day, but it has been romanticized over and over, especially on television, that the world has changed and it can't be put back in the bottle. The only problem is we have created a perpetual level of systemic damage to a large part of the consciousness of this planet due to that day. And here's what I want to propose. We talked about the millions of people who no longer exist on this planet because of the wars that followed up this day, rationalized by that day. The thing that keeps them alive is to say, well, we know that day was conducted by individuals that were corrupt. If we don't tell the other side that we know that, and we simply say, don't be angry at us anymore, we're going to go back to the way it was. That won't work because it does nothing to repair the lives that we have destroyed as a result of that day. At a minimum, there are two things that we have to do. As the people who allowed our organizations that govern us to conduct such an event, we have to acknowledge and expose 100% in the public eye, in the mass eye, that we do know that this was not what it was said to be. That the individuals that have been accused of that particular day are not the individuals that really orchestrated it in the official narrative. We have to publicly say. The country by which the identifications all rooted back to is now being accused of being a participant. In my research, I don't have any proof of that whatsoever. It was almost a patsy identification source of the individuals that didn't turn out to be from that country to begin with, because they're alive and well in many cases, right? Until I see evidence to the contrary, I think anyone peddling that story is either misinformed or they're part of the disinformation that keeps that day from being resolved. I think that needs to change. But now, how do you repair the damage? I think that the number one thing that we can do to repair the mental damage is to acknowledge it to those that are suffering as a result of being attacked due to that day. But we damaged way more than their minds, didn't we? We damaged their worlds. We damaged their communities. The amount of bombed out cities in their region of the world is almost too great to count. Those facilities need to be replaced and rebuilt under the guise that this was wrong to destroy it in the first place. But at the entire time that we're doing it, we have to say we were not involved with the destruction of this. This was a much higher game that was being played by individuals that are now the hunted as of 2018, so which is why we have to preserve those who are hunting them. Essentially, we have to make amends. And we won't persuade large portions of these individuals who have nothing else to live for. Their economies are bad. Their land is tough and hard. They don't like waking up in their region of the world for many reasons, which is why they're fleeing to countries that can provide subsidies. We allow the world to be all imbalanced, sort of as this prime directive notion that we're not to intervene in other countries. But the problem is we have intervened. Remember the show Star Trek? After Next Generations, Gene Roddenberry introduced the prime directive, saying we're not to touch a world until they've achieved warp speed, traveling at the speed of light. Once they reach that, they're now dabbling in the galaxy, and they must join the rest of us in the galaxy that can do the same thing. But what happens when they accidentally pollute? They get discovered. The mask gets pulled off. The phasers are discovered, and the communicators are discovered, and their ships are discovered in orbit. What do we do in that fictional show? We do everything we can to undo our knowledge, or their knowledge of us. Well, we can't do that in the real world, can we? The reality is if we ever did that in real life, as portrayed in the Star Trek series, there would have to be some hastened integration of that knowledge to say, well, we do exist, we mean you no harm, and when you achieve warp speed, which now you can make it your objective to do so, we will not give you technology to do it, you must learn it on your own. We're here with open arms and peace. We'll provide protection to you in the meantime, so rest easy. We won't participate in your political events, we won't tell you what clothes to wear or how to behave, but we're here to help when the time comes. But for these countries and these individuals that have been harmed as a result of this day on behalf of us through these corrupt factions that we allowed to occur, right? We now have to intervene. We now have to make amends somehow. It's going to be costly. So there's a mental element to it. We have to stop being so sure of ourselves. We have to take the Nukem sign off of our cars, out of the inside of our brains. And, you know, I've talked to many soldiers who've spent more than a decade over there in firefights. They've lost their loved ones, their buddies who are their loved ones. And they have a different opinion because they said these people are really violent and they really fight and they really have taken away invaluable assets from my life, being probably other human beings more than anything. They've taken an arm, they've taken a leg, they've taken eyesight, hearing. They've injected PTSD in some of our people. But we have done all the same to them tenfold, haven't we? The thing is we can't fight it out, right? We can't fight more wars to fix the problem. And for some people, that's very frustrating. It's a less is more sort of thing now. The good news is that currently, in this month, individuals are alive and well who are participating on all levels. For any of you who have been monitoring a certain individual that's been posting online very interesting cryptic messages on a fairly weekly basis. If this individual has any merit and any connection to what's really going on, which I believe this individual has proven beyond the shadow of a doubt they do have some connection, a lot more is happening to fix this problem than we know about. Even those who think you completely understand what he is saying. It's more. Our job as citizens, I believe, is to pause the effects of that day to the best of our ability. It can be the way that you get on a plane. It can be little surcharges in the bills that you pay at your house that have been injected as a result of that day. For some of you, it's monitoring the politics of the violations of our Constitution in your respective countries as a result of that day. Changing your mind about how you perceive this stuff is step number one. If you can affect change on society that starts to remove these layers of tyranny, then that's your second thing. If you have children, it's good to raise them with the full knowledge of what that day meant and what it means to you when they're ready, right? Don't try to pull a 4-year-old in and tell them all about how the world's a spooky place. They don't have the faculties to understand that. Whenever you determine they've got the ability to have an opinion, to hold in their mind one thought that gives any dimension to what is today's life, you can start explaining how we got here. Take time to explain what it was like before that day, because that should be very powerful. They may not be able to conceive of a world more free than that day, but if your kid's taking off their shoes and watching mommy and daddy take off their shoes and their belts and their jackets and pulling every single piece of equipment out of their luggage and getting inspected, it might be nice to say, kid, before you were born, it wasn't like this. And there was a day where it all changed. And we're trying to get back to that day. And whenever you want to ask me a question about that, your old man's here to explain it to you. Your mom's here to explain it to you. Now, some of you might be saying or thinking, yeah, but there are people out there that will continue trying to create these days to put us back in the box. That's why we have to effect major change in our governments, in our institutions that participate in supposedly trying to prevent these days. There are more good people out there than bad people. And again, there's so few people that are willing to do this that if you took a television and every pixel on your television, whether it be an 80-inch television or whatever, if you said every pixel on this screen that is white are the bad people, and every pixel on the screen that's not turned on, it's black, are the good people, I doubt you could see the pixel of the dark people because there are so few of them. But when you create a pyramid structure of control over society, all you need is the last particle on the top of a 8-mile-high pyramid to be corrupt before the whole thing gets infected from the bottom up, what we call a systemic problem, right? So it shouldn't be that hard to find a single particle on the top of a structure that points directly to that particle, right? This isn't a needle in the haystack necessarily. You just keep following up. It's not all about the money. It's all about the control. When I try to teach people, and when I do try to teach people, when they ask me, well, where are these people? Where's the particle? And I just say, just keep asking, who runs that organization? And then who runs that organization? Whether it be a banking organization or a government organization or some other organization. Just keep asking, who runs it? Who runs that? Who does that person report to? Who does that person report to? And when the org chart tops out, it's the org chart that's above that that's not written down anywhere that has all the culprits. You track their money, you track their lives. If anyone sealed their records to conceal where they came from, that's a good sign. I'm not talking about tax returns. Who are they friends with? Who do they mingle with? Doesn't mean a person who shakes a hand with someone is associated with that person. Photo ops happen all the time for people who are powerful and good. It's the decision makers. For those of you who've ever done sales before in your life, who do you want to talk to close the deal? You want to talk to the decision maker. You don't give a crap how powerful or how intense someone is in a sub-department. If they don't make the decision to purchase the product that you're selling or the service that you're selling, it's really a matter of lobbying that lower individual to have the opinion that when asked by the decision maker, should we buy this, they say, yes, I trust that person, I like this service. And they go, okay, I'm factoring that into my risk assessment as to whether or not to buy this service or this product. Well, the control structures that are on top of us are exactly the same. I think you feel me. Should be a lot of comments from you guys. There really should be. So I anticipate that. I'm anxious. As of this month, the censorship is getting pretty thorough. I was notified this morning that a artery of truth out there recently received notice that incriminating evidence against some recent events that was posted on a social media website, let's just leave it there, was actually removed or forcibly removed before that artery was allowed to be viewed by anyone else. I want to leave you with one last thing I want you to repeat over and over and over again to your family members, to your feeds, anywhere you have a feed. Don't injure your job or anything. Don't go on LinkedIn and start posting crap. Anywhere you have either anonymity or a group of people you trust, or just an average conversation with someone else. In this world, in most modern countries, if there's a crime committed and a person has knowledge of the crime and obstructs justice by concealing the evidence of the crime, in any way, shape, it can be construed in a court of law. You didn't tell a police officer. You didn't tell someone. And again, I know that there are circumstances where you can't trust certain law enforcement, but I think that's a very small case. At this point, we don't need to necessarily contact law enforcement about things. We need to contact each other about these things, create the viral awakening that we keep talking about, right? But those that aid and abet criminals get similar charges that the criminals get. The criminals typically get the higher incarceration timeframes, right? I had an acquaintance that it was not a friend of mine, but an acquaintance that was introduced to me once. It was a female, as a matter of fact. She was in the back of a car when some guys that she was hanging out with went inside and robbed a bank. They came back into the car. This is according to her story, of course. I don't think she had the balls to go inside, but she said she stayed in the car, didn't know what was going on, whatever. The gentleman that did the crime received 20 to 30 years. One guy got 20, one guy I think got 27. But the girl in the back of the car got 9 years. 9 years in prison. She didn't, as far as, well, they didn't get away with anything, for one thing. She hadn't done it before, as far as I know. She got 9 years. So any employee or owner or board of directors that infringe on two things. If you have a country that protects freedom of speech, then that's the first violation, and that should be probably one of the most paramount violations of the country you live in. Again, if I were to rent a property to you, I cannot say that you can't have this property because you're a certain race or you're a certain gender. There are organizations that protect you against someone behaving like that. Same thing goes for the First Amendment. But when we post incriminating evidence somewhere inside someone else's corporation that is governed by a constitution that corporation is benefiting from in its existence, right? They are aiding and abetting the crime that they are censoring against. Currently, because it's not happened before in America, I can't speak for other countries, we're sort of taken off guard and we're not going the full legal route that we should be going to go after these corporations and say, well, you have two choices. Either go out of business immediately, shutting down your company and liquidating all of your assets, or you have to allow freedom of speech. Right? Now, there is one freedom of speech that is illegal in the United States of America, and it's a very different thing. And we call it hate speech in America. It's hate speech in other countries as well. But like I said, there's something called assault. Someone threatening someone else's safety. Someone saying something that can be easily construed as doing harm to the other person. That is illegal. And that is something that can be censored because it is a crime. It is assault that has been captured in social media postings. So someone who threatens the safety or well-being of another person to damage or to kill, that can be removed, and that's what we should do. And then we should obviously go to the individual who's making those threats and press full charges to correct their mental state. And if they are unwilling to comply, then they can be incarcerated. If they are insane, they can be put in a hospital, maybe rehabilitated, but if nothing else, taken out of the cycle of population, right? So we don't have any more of this. The only uniqueness in this would be to say, if you believe someone to be a criminal, and you say, if they are a criminal, I hope that they are apprehended by the law, that's not assault. That is your opinion that was your opinion that they're guilty, and it's your opinion that they should suffer the normal judicial system. In some cases, without a jury, because they have committed high treason. But if an event occurs and commercial profit organizations are not covering the facts of the day, and you believe you have uncovered evidence that is contrary to what they're saying, or offers a different story of what happened because it's not being covered at all. No alternative narrative is being discussed, and you believe you have proof. You are 100% within your rights to publish those results. I should say this, in the meantime, until we gain consciousness and a law firm has the balls to go after these people, someone has the money to pay the law firm, or the law firm itself says, you know what, if this continues, we'll be out of a lot of the work that we have. And so in order to defend our own self-preservation, we need to step in and probably smack these guys down. Hopefully both will occur. You can get your own domain and your own website, use WordPress, and start publishing what you want on your site. Don't commit assaults. Just report the facts as you know. Be objective. But if it gets censored, there's no out in saying that, well, I was told to break the law, therefore I broke the law. So an employee engaging in censorship at a lower level has no immunity whatsoever in committing a crime, which in this country is violating the First Amendment. So I would say the censorship that's going on today, in some cases, is illegal and punishable by whatever would be the punishment for violating the Constitution of the United States, which, as far as I'm informed, is some of the highest crimes you can commit in this country, equal to murder. Okay? I think you feel me? If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. There's video, there's audio, there's a locked Facebook group. There is Patreon for those of you who want to contribute to the show. For those of you who do, thank you so much. The grinder's going off, so I'm going to sign off here. Hopefully you got what you needed. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.